Hey everyone, it's me, Drew Afwalo, host of the Comment Section Show. Come join me and one of my iconic special guests every week on the show as we dive into the dreaded comment sections of our tagged videos and take down the most terrible men on the internet, period. Somehow, they won't go away no matter what I do, no matter how incredibly awful and mean I am to them, but I don't mind doing this work. In fact, if I'm being honest, I think it's God's work. So make sure y'all follow me on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts for new episodes every Wednesday.
This episode is brought to you by Shopify. Whether you're selling a little or a lot, Shopify helps you do your thing, however you cha-ching. From the launch your online shop stage, all the way to the we just hit 1 million orders stage. No matter what stage you're in, Shopify's there to help you grow. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/special offer, all lowercase. That's shopify.com/special offer.
Atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy.
I'm Travis Taylor, a political scientist by training with my doctorate from the University of Kentucky and a public opinion researcher by day. I'm joined on this episode by Dr. Lindsay Cormack, the author of How to Raise a Citizen and Why It's Up to You to Do It, which was released just yesterday on August 13th. In it, Dr. Cormack explains how and why parents must help their children learn about politics and government. Dr. Cormack is a doting mom, a renowned scholar, and a force to be reckoned with in her community. She is an associate professor of political science and the director of the Diplomacy Lab at Stevens Institute of Technology in Hoboken, New Jersey. She graduated from the University of Kansas, which is a Kentucky Wildcat I won't hold against her, and she earned her PhD at New York University. And she's the pioneer of DC Inbox, a comprehensive collection of every e-newsletter ever sent by members of Congress. She still lives in the city that never sleeps, and judging by her productivity, I don't know that she does either. Dr. Cormack, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me, Travis. I'm excited to talk with you today.
I'm thrilled too. I'll start by saying I loved your book. As a parent, as a political scientist, as a former professor of political science, this was an incredible book. And so thank you for writing it. Thank you for the opportunity to read it. People who listen to this podcast, Lindsay, we're political junkies. And whether it's healthy or not, many of us eat, sleep, and breathe politics. And each of us have our own stories about how we came to be interested in politics and government. Now, you write a little bit about your story in your book, that you didn't learn these lessons about politics at home. So tell us your story. Where did your interest in politics and government come from?
Yeah, that's fun for me to think about. So when I grew up, I was in Kansas, and I grew up in a house that could be considered politically conservative, but really it was sort of politically bored or politically ignorant. It was something where this wasn't a topic that my family would talk about. And it even went so far as my parents, if they did sort of like hear someone wading into a political conversation saying something like, that's not polite, it kind of got lumped in with things like asking about money or talking about religion or talking about sex. And so it's something where in the home, these are not sort of lessons that I learned. And how I got into it is when I went to college, I asked myself, what is it that you don't know a lot about that these people could teach you about? And I ended up majoring and minoring in things that sort of fit that criteria. So I majored in political science and I minored in African and African American studies because I thought these were like two big holes. There's plenty of holes in what I do and don't know. But I was like, these are things that can get filled here at the University of Kansas. So why don't I go ahead and learn those things?
All right. And so that took you obviously from the University of Kansas through a couple of political jobs, if I remember correctly, and then to NYU, where you got a PhD. What spurred that interest in you that in those classes at KU that made you go, I want to learn more about this?
Well, I had two really good political science professors and one really good comms professor who really pushed me in those directions. One was Eric Herron. The other was Fiona Yap. And then in communications, there was Dr. Scott Harris. And all of them sort of said, you're interested in this thing, you should think about it. But no one really pushed me in the direction of a PhD. And instead, I ended up going to DC thinking I was going to work in lobbying or something like that. And I did that for a year, but then I realized I really like being in a classroom. I really like learning. And the idea of a PhD was really exciting to me. So that's when I got started on applying, and I applied to like 16 different schools. And when NYU accepted me, it was sort of easy. I was married to someone who was going to go to Columbia. And so I was like, okay, well, I'll just move and go to New York City and see what that's like. And I really like New York City, and I kind of think it's going to be where I am forever.
You must like it a lot. You've stuck around there, even though you have to commute over to New Jersey to work.
That's right. Yeah, there's like a little bit of a commute, but it's a reverse. And, an academic teaching sort of job is really nice for those sorts of things. I have summers off, and I only have to go in, 3 to 4 days a week. So it's not so bad.
Yeah, you've not had to go in for quite a while. You've been on sabbatical writing this fantastic book. So let's talk about that. So let's start kind of simple. Just tell the listeners, I introduced the book, but tell the listeners a little bit more what the book's about. What's the premise of this book?
Sure. So I wrote a book that I call How to Raise a Citizen and Why It's Up to You to Do It. And I like this second piece. It actually was the idea of my daughter to say, and why it's up to you to do it. Because I teach at a school where I have really good students. They are bright, they are good at doing school, and when they graduate, they go on to amazing careers. But as the person who's teaching them Intro to Political Science, I get a front row view to how little they know about our systems. And I've been doing this for 10 years, but about 5 years ago, I started thinking we've got to figure this out. It's not their fault that they come into college not knowing all these things. And New Jersey actually does a lot better than many states in teaching high schoolers about civics. And so I set out thinking I was going to write a book about how different states prepare their high schoolers to graduate into a system and be able to participate in our democracy. And in doing that work, I had 5 research assistants. We interviewed teachers from all over the United States. We looked at test scores. We looked at different civics curricula across the United States. And it became increasingly clear that this is a problem that can't be solved in our schools. And so I sort of scoured the market and said, what is there about helping parents to teach their kids these things? And there's really not a lot. And I know it's not what academic political scientists do typically. They don't typically write parenting books. But I thought, you know what? This is something that there's a gap in this market. We have to figure it out. And so why don't you start with a book that can kind of help parents get those messages across to their kids? And that's sort of the genesis of the project.
Okay. And so there's a lot of, you mentioned political scientists don't typically write parenting books, but there's a lot of great parenting advice in this book that has absolutely nothing to do with politics. Everything from active listening to admitting when you don't know something, spending time in intentional conversations with your child. So is this a book about politics or is it a book about parenting?
Oh, I like that question. That's fun. It's both. And I didn't, go out there thinking I'm going to write something that, you could apply it to many other parts of life, but I suppose you could. You're right. Like active listening isn't just, how you learn about someone's political views, but it's also how you understand them better. But that's sort of a reason that I think we need to move politics into the parenting discussion. Because parents want to get to know their kids and kids want to get to know their parents. And so why not have this other piece that's really sort of critical for what we're doing here in the United States be a part of those conversations, allow us to talk about these things with our kids, with others in front of our kids in ways that we model behavior that'll then be healthier for all of us. I think sort of mixing these things together made sense for me.
And so who's the target audience? Who did you write this book for? Who listening to our show should go out right now and click on the Amazon link and click buy this book?
So if anyone feels like our politics isn't functioning that well or doesn't feel that good, that's a reason to learn a little bit more. This book is aimed for parents and grandparents and educators or anyone who's really around children, because I want people to understand that we have systems in place that we think are going to work to educate our kids to become active participating citizens. But in most of the country, they are not working. And so it's kind of up to us as the adults in the room right now to say, you know what, this doesn't feel good. It's not working that well. We have to do something to fix it. And so anyone who feels that they're like a little out of their depth or they don't like the way things are going, no matter for what reason, learning a little bit more and understanding how to pass that information down to the next generation is a way to form a better politics. It's geared primarily at parents, grandparents, educators, but people with kids in their lives also stand to benefit from thinking about the things that are in this book.
And so What about the listeners who don't have kids in their lives? Is there anything in the book for them?
Yeah, I think so. So I've been doing some more research talking about like civic role models. And when you're looking at the work that's happening in that field right now, when we ask kids who their civic role models are, it's not always their parents. It's not always their teachers. Sometimes it's someone who they see in their community who's doing good things or giving back or volunteering or whatever. And they might not have kids either. And so if don't know who's looking up to you, you might not be sure of like how you can best be a civic role model. But I think we all have a role to play in righting the sort of wrongs that our politics feels like right now. So I do think there's stuff in there. I also think there's some interesting things for people who aren't parents in thinking about the systematic failures that we have and how schools can't get this work done. So, not everyone who has kids is going to be the only people who consider or think about or worry about our schools. People who worry about schools can be people who just care about the health of this country. And so they don't necessarily have to have kids to have that care.
I love this idea of civic role models. Is there perhaps a sequel coming out to this book that covers civic role models, or how are you diving into this topic a little bit more?
Well, what I've written is something that I think looks at it a lot from the perspective of parents, and the sort of things that I'm thinking about next is from the perspective of kids. Is it like, what is it that they say that they need or that they think that they're seeing right now? And that truly wasn't the focus of this first one. It was very much how can we as parents sort of bridge these gaps? But the next sort of follow-up thoughts that I'm thinking about is like, what do kids say that they need or what do kids say that they want? And it's just a little bit harder because it's hard to know what you don't know. And that's just sort of like curiosities that are keeping me going. As for a sequel, that seems so far off for me. I'm like, there's so much more in rolling this out and getting this done. But those are thoughts that I'm having.
Okay. That sounds great. You wrote something in the book that really struck me as interesting and quite frankly, pretty profound. And you wrote that you start and end every semester as a professor by telling your students something. And you shared that with parents and other readers in this book. You say that politics is going to happen to us whether we like it or not. Tell the listeners what you mean by that.
Well, I very truly do mean that. And I say that not just to my students, but to almost anyone who expresses disbelief or, they don't want to get involved in politics. And what I mean by that is politics influences so many parts of our lives. There's virtually nothing that isn't touched by politics. The criteria by which your roads get fixed, that's a political decision. The zoning that happens in your neighborhoods and communities, that's political decisions. The water that you drink, the pipes that are used in your cities, those are political decisions. Everything really touches politics. And I teach at a school where very few students actually major in political science. Most of them are engineers. And so when I do projects in some of my classes, I'll say like, pick whatever it is that interests you and let's go find how it's involved in politics. And I think that's something where eventually they come around and they're like, oh, you're right. Politics is going to happen to us, whether we like it or not. So we might as well understand it. And something else that I like to think about is that no one likes playing a game that they don't understand the rules to. And so if politics is going to happen to all of us, no matter if we like it or not, we might as well understand those rules so we can play the game a little bit better.
So, Lindsay, you and I are about the same age. Our kids are kind of in that same age range. How do you respond to somebody in our kind of peer group? If one of our peers comes up to you and says, I've made it all these years without this so-called civic education, and I seem to be doing okay. So I think my kids will be just fine without it. What do you say to somebody who has that kind of mindset?
Well, I'll say I actually don't encounter that much. I usually encounter people saying, I feel like I don't know enough. I very rarely encounter someone who says like, oh, I've got this figured out and things are clipping along just fine. But I imagine if that were to be the case, something that I would say to them is that if they think that, they have the civic education in place that is okay for them, it might be due to a school system that served them 20 or 30 years ago. That's really not the school systems that we have in place. And even when we were going to school, you and I, civics education was on the wane. It's been going down since the 1950s. And so time is just not being allocated it to in school. So if we thought we had a good civic education, the ones that our kids are getting on average is worse because there's just fewer curricular hours that are dedicated to it and way few dollars.
And so you said that you're encountering a lot of people who just don't know much about politics. And I get the sense that that's pretty prevalent, is that many parents just simply don't know that much about civics or politics or government. So the subtitle of the book is Why It's Up to You to Do It. Why is it up to parents who just don't know that much about this topic? Why is it up to them to teach their kids about something they themselves know very little about?
Yeah, so I wish that wasn't the case. I wish I could have a magic wand and say, you know what, schools, all these institutions, you have the responsibility of making sure that kids who graduate into the democratic process understand that process by which they're going to control. But the reason that parents have to do it is fourfold. The first reason is that schools, on average, around the United States tend to only give one semester to civics. Now, it's different everywhere because each of the 50 states has its own approach. And most of the 50 states devolve those decisions down to school board levels or individual school levels. And if you throw in all the independent and private schools, there's just like a wide variety of civics instruction that happens. But the modal sort of strategy is you wait until the second semester of a senior year, the idea being that they're close to registering to vote, and then you try to cram all the things in right there. That's not how we do anything else in our education system. Everything else we scaffold from K through 12. But for government, a lot of times it just gets shunted into that last semester of your senior year. And I don't know what you were like, but I certainly wasn't in like a receptive mode of like, let me go learn a lot of new things right now, because it's a hard time. Those kids are looking forward to college or work or whatever life is after high school. And so there's a problem in the way that we do this instruction kind of across the board. The second reason is schools have this challenge where they really want to focus on things that matter for their metrics, both in terms of funding that they get, prestige they get, and also how they place kids into college. And the two big metrics that matter is how these kids do on SATs and ACTs. Neither one of those tests has any sort of government or social studies focus. The SAT never has, and the ACT used to, but doesn't anymore. And so when we understand they are stressed in terms of what sorts of content they can provide to their kids, they're going to pick the things that matter for those metrics, and civics is the stuff that gets cut. Many of the social studies and civics teachers that we talked through across the United States said they wanted to do more. They just simply didn't have the time to do it because the focus was on other things. Another reason that things are getting harder to teach in schools versus not is that state legislatures are increasingly exerting oversight on how things happen in high schools, such that they have to be more restrictive versus open. And I'll give you an example. In the state of Texas, a few of the schools adopted a model that's kind of known as action civics, which is you have high school students who try to find something that's in their community that maybe they don't like. Maybe, their facilities for recreation aren't being maintained, their parks are getting dirty, whatever. And then they go out and propose a plan to whoever it is that's responsible for that. So whether that's a city council or some other sort of local committee board, what have you. And they try to contact them and say, here's this problem, here's a remedy we have, can we talk to you about it? And the state of Texas's legislature has said they're no longer going to permit that sort of thing that looks like advocacy to happen in schools. So instead, we go back to this old model of teaching civics, which is highly theoretical, where we tell kids, here is the idea of how the government works, but we don't allow them to interact with it in a way that we know helps them learn. So we have thing one is there's curricular crowd out, and then we have it's hard to do these things in the second semester of senior year, and then the state legislatures are making it worse. But the fourth reason is parents themselves. We were doing our interviews after 2020, which meant that there was a lot more oversight from parents onto individual teachers because they could hear Zoom classrooms and everything that was happening in the pandemic. They just had more awareness of what was happening in the classrooms. And teachers are afraid to talk about politics. They're afraid to talk about government, even in the most basic, vanilla, straightforward ways. Because if a student hears something and they come back to their parents and they say, my teacher said there's 3 branches of government and Congress is the best branch because it's the first one in the Constitution or whatever. And they misconstrue that as like, my teacher doesn't like the president. Then those teachers face something that's like parental blowback, either in the form of angry email, a Facebook group that gets riled up, calls to their principals or administrators, and they don't really want to deal with that. And it's not that they don't want to teach this, it's that their incentives are just tricky right now, where wading into those topics feels more dangerous than it should. And so they'd rather teach something where they're not going to get blowback from parents and students. And so there's things that make our schools problematic sites for imparting these lessons. But I think everyone understands that the way that politics feels right now is not good. And the only way that I think we change those things is if more people kind of understand the systems that are at play and some of these other pieces that can help write our politics versus letting us continue to drown in these media narratives of like, everything, the sky is falling. If this person's elected, it's over, regardless of which party you sit at. We need to have something that seems more realistic and something that's rooted in the understandings of the limits of power and how people can interact. And that's what I'm hopeful for what parents can do.
This episode is brought to you by Shopify. Whether you're selling a little or a lot, Shopify helps you do your thing, however you cha-ching. From the launch your online shop stage, all the way to the we just hit 1 million orders stage. No matter what stage you're in, Shopify's there to help you grow. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/special offer, all lowercase. That's shopify.com/special offer.
Make this new school year an opportunity for your kids to learn important life skills with Greenlight. Greenlight is a debit card and money app for families where kids learn how to save, invest, and spend wisely, while parents keep an eye on kids' money habits. Greenlight also helps families get into their fall routine with a chores feature that lets parents assign chores and pay kids allowance when they check them off. Get your first month free at greenlight.com/Spotify. Greenlight.com/Spotify.
So it was a really kind of deep dive into why our schools are not currently equipped to handle this. If you had your magic wand and you could wave it over the school system and let educators handle this, what would that look like for you?
I think it would be something that starts kindergarten and then gets layered on all the way up to 12th grade. There's a few big things that we miss in the way that we teach civics. One is we teach it in a way where we make our students spectators. We sort of tell them, many years ago, some very smart people got together and they wrote this Constitution, and it's a great document, don't you think? And then we give them these sort of like simplistic ideas of how checks and balances work, where it looks like a game of rock, paper, scissors, where each branch sort of checks each other and no one can really win. And that's not strictly true. We know that there's powers that have shifted over time. But we rely on these sort of like simplistic, passive spectator stories to teach most of our politics right now. And part of it is we have to do it in one semester. So it's hard to get anything deeper. So if I could wave a magic wand, it would start in kindergarten with just sort of like getting them familiar with the vocabularies that they need. And by the time you get to 10 to 14 and those like middle school ages, you can start to do some of those harder concepts. And some people push back on this. They're like, kids, they can't really hold all those details in their head. But as someone who's raising a daughter and as someone who's around kids a lot, kids can hold a lot of details in your head. Maybe you have kids who are playing sorts of like role player games, or they have card games with each other, where there's like all sorts of like, this house is better than this house, or this power beats this power. Like they understand really complicated things, and we could do it with government. I also think something that we really miss is the idea of any sort of understanding of government below the federal system. Everyone focuses on the president, everyone focuses on the Supreme Court and the Congress to an extent, but we really don't do a lot in teaching people about what the state level is made up, what the local government looks like, despite the fact that those are the people who make so many of our quality of life decisions, and increasingly the state level changes the way that we actually live. I mean, if you think about some of the big policy spaces of the last few years, reproductive health and drug policies are things that are set by the states. But when you ask college students, like, what does the word gubernatorial mean? They don't know. They won't know that that's about a governor because no one's really talked to them about those sorts of executives. And so we need to focus longer in the time frame, and we need to get to things that are more rooted closer to home versus just focusing on the sort of like amorphous, far away federal government.
So you said something a minute ago that politics just doesn't feel good. And you write about this quite a bit in the book, that Americans tend to have this kind of negative perception of politics and of government. We see it both in kind of the language that's used in everyday conversations. We see it in approval ratings from survey research. How can learning about the systems of government negate that or lessen that kind of negative perception of politics and government?
Sure. So I'm not sure that it can, but I do think it's a place to start. And my reason for that is it's easy to distrust something that you don't know a lot about, and it's easy to discredit something that everyone else is already discrediting. And this sort of starts in our early childhood socialization. If you watch like some children's television or read some children's literature, often the way that a government official is sort of portrayed. It can be like a mayor or something that'll be portrayed as like, at best, kind of a bumbling doofus, or at worst, out to do ill to a city. And so we sort of like start with these narratives that are harmful in childhood, and they sort of grow. And when we say like, you know what, I don't like that system, it's dirty, it's there's like so much corruption in it, it's easier for us to like sort of distance ourselves and say, that's not my fault, that's someone else's fault. And we kind of think that for a lot of our politics. But truly, living in a democracy is wonderful. It's like one of the only systems where we, the people, get to change the fate of our lives. But if we just keep saying like, you know, it's all bad and everyone else is messing it up, we disengage and we give ourselves permission to not be a part of any solution. But I think when we say, you know what, actually, Trisha down the street, she's running for city council. I think she has some ideas about ways we could change this. You know what, maybe I'll learn a little bit more about that race. When is that primary? How does she get on the ballot? Does she need signatures and petition? Those sorts of things sort of like humanize the process and allow us to feel as active participants versus people who are being participated on by nefarious others. And I think it's not surprising to me that people don't like systems that they don't understand and that they distrust. And the only way that I can think to get at this is make sure that we understand them a little bit more. We might not trust them. You might say like, oh, I learned a lot and it's worse than I thought. But you'll have a more rooted sense of that idea versus this sort of like fear that just sort of like sits with people, or this distaste that sits with people that they can't really put a finger on. It's just that they know politics is bad.
So, Lindsay, I'm struck by a couple of things that you just said recently, that there's this kind of connection in my head. It's on the one hand, we don't have this personalization. We don't know people in politics. And the other thing that you said is that we tend to focus on the federal government, the presidency, the Congress, the federal courts. And it's interesting to me that these two things are happening at the same time, that our focus is on these big national things, these big national structures and institutions and problems. And at the same time, we don't have an understanding of our local governments, and we don't have this personal connection to it.
Yeah, that's true. And I think it's harmful, because I think when we don't understand government as just people, but instead we think of it as this sort of like amorphous power that's out to do ill, that's problematic. And it's not true. Most of the people who are working in state and local government are volunteering their time, and they're trying to work towards their version of a good life. And it might be different than the one that you see, but they're using their time, they're using their expertise and trying to make the best decisions that they can. And that's something that I do talk to people who have younger kids about what can they do. Something that I think is really important is just humanizing it, letting them meet someone who's doing that work. I have a sister-in-law who talks about the time that she got to shake Bob Dole's hand, and it like really stuck with her. And I was like, I think that does happen to kids. They get to meet one politician and they get to say like, oh, that's a real person. That's not just, some big bad government that the media is telling me about. It's an actual person. And when you get down to the local level, you're going to find people who look a lot like you. They're going to be parents. They're going to be coaches of softball teams. They're going to be people who want more green space, or maybe they want to have cleaner water, whatever it is. They're tangible things that we all sort of can understand, and they might get to fixing those things in different ways than you or I, but they're trying. And I think that's a really good lesson for kids to live. And one of the best things about being in a democracy is that it is a government that we, the people, get to go ahead and do. So you might as well get to know who those people are who are doing that work at your local level.
Yeah, exactly. And to take it even a step further, it's like these normal people that are in government also have families that do normal things. I was thinking that a few months ago, I was at the dealership with my car in the shop, and I struck up a conversation with the woman that was in the waiting room with me. And it turns out that she was the wife of my state representative. And so it would have been this awesome opportunity had my sons been with me to see that, hey, here's this politician's wife doing the same thing that my dad's doing. It's like, these are just normal people.
Absolutely. Yeah. They're normal people living normal lives with that little extracurricular bit of trying to do good things for the rest of us. That's what I think most of them think they're trying to do.
So I want to dig into the book just a little bit. So you listed 5 essential civic skills in the book that parents need to help their children develop. And I'll go through them right quick. Having difficult conversations, voting, an understanding of primary versus general elections, knowledge of the U.S. Constitution, and this concept of federalism. There are a lot of civic skills that you could have covered, and I know you didn't set out to write an encyclopedia. You had to make choices about what to cover. So how did you narrow it down from this seemingly endless list of civic skills that students need to these 5?
Yeah, so you're right. There is, some choices I had to make there. And part of it is that I think we are all better off if we have people who have civic know-how or government know-how versus government trivia. So a lot of times you'll see these surveys that come out that say like, college students don't know a lot of stuff. They don't know who wrote the Constitution. And I don't know that actually matters that much. I mean, I think it's important sort of from a historical sense, but I think it matters more to say like, well, what does it take to change the Constitution? How do we get an amendment? Those sort of like things that say like, how can we get from point A to point B versus how do we get to point A in the first place? And so that was sort of like one of the guiding principles. And then the second thing that I looked for in making this list was the things that when we talked to high school civics teachers, what wasn't getting covered. And so voting is one of the really interesting ones where some of the schools have prohibitions about having like voter registration forms on campus. And they also don't want to talk about voter registration because they kind of have to get into partisanship, especially in closed primary states where you have to register with a party to participate. And so that was sort of the two big pieces is like, how do we get to know how? And then what is it that's not being covered in schools that parents could do in their own homes with their kids in the 18 years that they have them before they become eligible to vote?
And so then what are the ties that bind these 5 things together? What do they have in common?
So I kind of think of them originally sort of like sequentially, but then, when you get all 5 of them, they're kind of interconnected. So when I think about it, this first piece of like how to have hard conversations, that's an umbrella that covers all of these things. Because something that I find as a college professor is by the time I get these students, they're 18 to 22. And a lot of times they are afraid of having sorts of conversations that might be controversial or uncomfortable in some ways, because they've either been taught that like discomfort is something that they have to avoid at all cost, or they're afraid of what social sanctioning is going to happen from their peers if they say something that feels like incorrect or maybe outdated or maybe offensive. And we in our homes have the ability over a child's lifetime to let them try these things out, make mistakes and fix them. And so having those hard conversations is sort of this like umbrella piece that I think parents have a responsibility to practice with their kids so that when they do get into the world, they've been able to do this in a trusted, caring, loving environment. And then when I get on to the next 4, they're sort of like sequentially important in building the know-how part that I stress versus the trivia part. So voting is easy for me. Voting is number 1 in the sense that you really can't participate in our democratic system until you learn how to register to vote. And so parents should help their kids learn to register to vote, and they need to tell them that when they move, that doesn't go with them, because that's something I found in college where I'm, taking students. We have a little thing called Ducks to the Polls, where we take our students to the polls. We don't care how they vote. We just take them there so they can vote. And then we go out for ice cream at Ben and Jerry's after. And something that I find is I'll have students who come to vote and then they're like, oh, well, I registered, but it'll be in another county. And so they'll have to cast a provisional ballot, which is, it's kind of a pain and it doesn't feel good for your first time. And so parents have that responsibility to say like, here's how you can get this piece done. Because without voting, your connective pieces to democracy are just really limited. When I talk about primaries versus general elections, this is because when we look at which elections tend to be those competitive ones that matter in terms of if you're going to pick a winner or a loser, increasingly in many different parts of the United States, that happens at the primary. And we're kind of seeing this right now in sort of the discussions that we have about the presidential election even, where we're having, these big conversations about the general election, but everyone's saying like, oh, maybe we should have done something differently in the primary. It's like, okay, well, maybe if we knew a little bit more about primaries, then we'd have these abilities to have these discussions, these debates, these figurings out earlier. But a lot of people do not learn about primary elections in the course of their high school. Instead, they'll usually only learn about one election, and that's the presidential election, which is unlike any other election that we have for any other position in the United States. So talking about those differences, I think, is very important because that's where the action is in a lot of places. This third bit on federalism is something that kind of gets at what I mean when I talk about humanizing politics, which is the local level, the state level do so much, but we tend to focus on the federal level. And, as you know, federalism is just sort of what are the conversations, the overlapping and the individual powers that these different levels have, and how do they sort of enact policies on those levels. And I think when you understand that, you say like, I really hate that school starts at 8:20. I wish the president would change that. And it's like, well, the president's not going to change that because even though he might be the most powerful person, he doesn't have that power. That's a local power. And so sort of understanding those pieces are also about civic know-how. It's where to go when something's wrong. Who do you call? That's something that you have to kind of fold into this understanding of federalism. And this last bit is one that I actually thought I was going to get the most pushback, but I've been doing talks with parent-teacher association groups in New York City. And this last bit is, I think every child should read the Constitution at least one time before they're 18. And I thought people would say like, oh, that's like really hard, or the language is really difficult. But that's the thing that when I've been talking to parents, they've been like, oh, can I get a version of the Constitution and do that with them? And the answer is like, absolutely, yes. There's so many on the internet. And I have an entire chapter that's sort of dedicated to how do we talk about the Constitution with our kids? And it's not something where I think you need to like sit down and do it all in one setting and then like grill your kids after to make sure they understand it. But it is our charter of government. It is the system that we live in. And so I think it's a good idea for all of us to at least read the rule book once before we graduate into 18-year-olds who can then participate in that system. I thought it was going to be a hard ask, but I'm finding that parents actually are pretty okay with that and interested themselves to go back and read it, sometimes for the first time or sometimes just to kind of brush up because they haven't done it in a while.
Yeah, that was one thing that I really liked about the book is, as we talked about earlier, a lot of parents just don't have this knowledge. And so there's a pretty substantial chunk of the book that's dedicated to breaking down these fundamental issues in a way that's really accessible, really easy to understand, and in a way that I think sets parents up for success in talking about these issues with their children.
Well, I'm certainly hopeful for that because this is not something where I'm like trying to scold anyone for like not doing enough, because most of us were raised in times and in places where we either didn't learn about this in schools because it just like wasn't in the curriculum or our teachers didn't feel comfortable doing it. Or in like my case, there's many parts of the country where politics was kind of seen as an off limits conversation. You couldn't talk about it. And so the parents of today, it's not like it's their fault that we're in this situation, but we are the people who are capable of remedying it. So we can learn a little bit more and impart that to our kids.
Yeah, absolutely. And when we talk about hard conversations, there's a lot of debate. There are a lot of issues going on in politics today that some people might say just have some adult themes. And so you write in your book about talking to your daughter about the Dobbs decision after that came out. So we've got issues related to abortion, to transgender issues. Just last month, we saw the attempted assassination of a former president and a presidential candidate. How do we engage kids in political discussions without exposing them to content that some people might find objectionable or inappropriate?
Yeah, I think this is really difficult. And this is one where we kind of have to go back to the idea that everyone knows their kids best. But there is a line where we go from protecting them to disempowering them. And I think we also have this added hurdle of parents today in that our kids can access this stuff if they want to, for the most part. So like, you might have a child who you think like doesn't know anything about abortion, but if they keep hearing, like abortion decision or reproductive health or something, they can go to an Alexa and say, what is an abortion? Or they can go to Siri or Google or whatever sort of like assistant you have in your home to kind of figure these things out. And kind of like those hard conversations around sex or drug use or alcohol, I think that it's generally better if you have a parent or a trusted adult be able to work through those things with you versus getting into the vagaries of the internet to see what they're going to tell you. And so while I am sympathetic to the idea that there are topics that are really difficult and that we might not want to have our kids have to shoulder the weight of, if they are at an age where they can go ahead and access that information on their own, we're doing them a disservice in not being willing to have those conversations. I think more so than sort of these like, abortion or drug policy things. I think some of the things that parents are challenged with when we look at foreign policy or international policy, where, there's things like war and death and strife and famine. And that's one where, it doesn't make sense to scare your kids over something that they can't control and likely isn't going to come to them. But if we're afraid that they're going to be able to scare themselves or work themselves up, whether that's talking to friends or people online who might not have their best interests at heart, I think it is better for us to be willing to have those conversations versus pushing them away and making them do that work on their own.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I love what you said, that we as parents know our kids better than anybody else. And so I know that that's a good part of the answer to this next question too, but you offer advice on talking to kids who fall into different age ranges. But at what age should we start talking to our kids about politics and government and civics, and why at that age?
Yeah, so this is a good question about like how we do this intentionally or when we do this intentionally. But I think something that I'll push back on is that our kids are seeing us do or not do politics from the time they're born. Like if they, overhear us talking with a family member about something we're frustrated on politics and they like see us get rageful or angry about something, even though we're not talking to them, they're seeing that, they're learning that. Same thing if we're not involved at all. If we never go vote and they've never seen a polling station because we never bring them with us, they're learning something there too. It just, it's like an unlearning. It's not an understanding of this. But in terms of when it's fine to talk about politics in front of your kids, I think it's fine as soon as they show sort of an understanding of these things. Kids are trying to figure out their world. Like that's essentially the job of a child, is sort of like make sense of the world around me and figure out how I operate within it. And they do sort of engage in proto-politics. Like if you take kids to a public playground and they have to like take turns on a slide, or there's only so many swings and more kids, they have to figure out, like who's going to do this. Or anytime they're playing sort of games where they're like playing house or there's sort of like family bands or whatever, they're figuring out different like rules, decision-making criteria, what have you. And so we have this idea that kids like maybe aren't interested or they're not ready or they don't have any political thoughts. And in the research that I did in preparing for this book, that's not true. They are interested. They're doing their own sort of proto-politics. And so as soon as we are, approached by them in sorts of ways that they invite this conversation, that's the time to do it. And let's say, you have a kid who isn't much interested in this and they don't come to you. Then the way that you can sort of model this behavior is being willing to have these conversations in front of them. So they might not care about these topics yet. But if you have other people in your life do, maybe a spouse, maybe a sibling, maybe a coworker or a friend, let them observe that. You don't like bring them in and say like, watch us talk, but don't say, oh, we should talk about this when they're not around. Let them see you do that. You need to model that behavior. And so that's a way that we can do these things kind of at any age.
Yeah, I'll tell you, this book was really convicting for me because I'm a political junkie. I'm a political scientist by training. As I said at the top of the show, I eat, sleep, and breathe this. I work in the political and policy realm. And still, I didn't know how to talk to my kids. My boys are 8 and 4. And so I still didn't know how to talk to them about politics and about policy. And so it was really convicting for me to read your book and go, I should be the one doing this. And I already have an advantage over a lot of parents who, are relearning these things along with their child, or learning these things for the first time along with their child, that I already know a lot of this information. I just need a framework to be able to share that with my kids. And it came in really handy. At one point, as I was reading the book, my oldest son asked me what I was reading. And so I was able to tell him I'm reading a book about talking to your kids about politics. And so just reading the book and sharing with him that I was reading a book about this was this huge door thrown open to talking about these issues.
I'm so glad to hear that. And I think, Travis, a lot of people are in that same boat because we just don't really even conceive of it as in the parenting set of concerns. And we kind of think like someone else is going to take care of it or it's going to happen in another way. And I don't really think that's anyone's fault. But I do think as soon as we become aware of it, we have to do something. Like we know that they're not going to get this anywhere else. It's good for us to do that work. So I'm happy that sort of like inspired just even the smallest conversation between you and him. And you're right. You do have a leg up on so many people because you know so many things already.
So thinking about this family dynamic, in 2013, Gallup reported that 64% of Americans did not want their child to be involved in politics as a career. Just 7 years later, according to the American Family Survey conducted by Brigham Young University, that share was up to 90%. So in 7 years, we went from 64% of Americans saying, I don't want my kids involved in politics, to 90%. 9 out of 10 American parents said away. And in addition to that, a State Policy Network poll recently reported that 56% of Americans have stopped talking about politics altogether because they find it too divisive. What's going on with American parents and with Americans in general, and how can we turn this ship around to get parents to say, okay, maybe this is a good career path, or get Americans talking about these issues again?
Okay, so first things first, I really like that you said turn this ship around, because there's like this key analogy that I didn't put in the book because it didn't come until some of the work that I did afterwards, which was I've started talking to people about politics. I just like set up a little sign and say, will you chat with me about politics? And the reason that I like this ship imagery is a lot of people seem to think that they're just like passengers on the ship of politics. And they're just like, the waves are really doing it, or we're going in the wrong direction. And they don't realize that we are actually the crew. Like, we are actually the ones that are capable of changing this. We are not just along for the ride. And so we do need to right this thing. And it's us who's, kind of letting it get all over the place in the first place. But as to these statistics that you shared on, how few people want to let their kids go into politics and how people don't want to talk about politics, the first one, I wholeheartedly understand. Like, when you look at what a political career looks like now, we have political violence. We have top candidate for the top office being hit by a projectile or a bullet during a speech. No one wants to send their kids into something that looks like, maybe someone could come after you for an assassination. There's also even lower level politicians where people are just like yelling at them or coming to their home or doxing them. I understand you might not want your kids to go do that. That makes sense to me. And I don't think any of that changes until we both turn down the tone of these things and say, like, hey, we're adults. We are not toddlers. We are not just going to like yell this through and get it done. We need to figure it out. But also, there needs to be some sort of like prestige rebuilding of politics. When I think about politicians that people looked up to in my lifetime, I know that the first George Bush was someone that my parents' generation looked up to and thought, this is a man who's trying to do good work for his country. Not everyone shares that opinion, of course, but plenty of people did. And then when I think about who inspired people in more recent times, Obama as a candidate was someone who had like sort of this like youthful charisma and this hopeful attitude. And that's something that people could look up to. And I think when we focus on national politics as the way that we do this, it's unsurprising that people aren't going to want to get into it. But go find a local city council member doing their best, or go find a parks commissioner who's caring to make sure that the parks in your city are doing better, and think about what that looks like. It's such a worthwhile thing to be able to give back to the community that you're going to live in. And most of our politicians are at that level. Most of them are state and local people doing things very close to home. But we focus on sort of like the federal politicians and understand why people don't want to do it. In terms of why we don't want to talk about politics, I understand this one very well. For a long time, I've been in a mixed sort of political family where we had people who identified as Democrats and people who identified as Republicans, people who identified as sort of outside the system. And there was sort of like a tipping point around the 2016 election where we had a result that people didn't expect. And then there was sort of unwillingness to engage in this because people were so turned off, and they sort of thought the people who they were talking to that they disagreed with were either idiots or evil. And that is not true. Like, no matter where you're sitting on the political spectrum, the idea that you are absolutely right and everyone else is either dumb or out to do bad is simply not correct. We have different opinions here. We have different perspectives here. We've lived different lives. We have different goals. We have different ways of trying to get to those goals. Just because they are different doesn't mean that they are wrong. And this is something where, again, we're going to have to go back to basics here, because right now we have sort of like this runaway train that no one understands how to slow down, because no one even understands the tracks. They don't understand the machinery. They don't know how to like take the brake. Like, all of these pieces are out because we just don't know the systems that we're working in. And so it's not my contention that if we all learn this, we're all going to get along. But I do think that if we all learn this, there's two big pieces that will fall into place. One is people will be less likely to have knee-jerk reactions, and they'll be less likely to be scared by the media. And I'll use a quick example on the impeachment of Donald Trump towards the end of his term. When that happened, I remember like 16 weeks of coverage that was like, is he going to get impeached? Yes or no? It was breaking news all the time. Everyone's all up in arms about this. And to me, I was like, I don't know. Is 2/3 of the Senate from the opposite party? I don't think he's going to get impeached. Like, you just can't get that heightened if you understand what has to happen. If you understand, like, oh, if these pieces aren't in play, we're not going to go anywhere. Or same thing with the Dobbs decision. When people are like, can you believe it? The Supreme Court's making these decisions. And my answer is like, well, yes. If we look about who's appointing these people and how there are sort of politics at play in the courts, despite the fact our narrative that it's the apolitical branch, it's not surprising. It's not frustrating. It's understandable. And I think having those sorts of like ways to understand things by having the knowledge and the civic know-how to figure out why you get to these results is a way to take the temperature down, because misinformation, disinformation, or even just inflammatory pseudo-information plays on ignorance. It plays on where there's gaps in our knowledge. And if we close those gaps or make them a little bit tighter, there's just less wiggle room for us to get riled up about things because we have a more reasonable understanding of what's to come or what could be expected.
So if you could have the listeners walk away from this episode of The Politics Guys with just one or two kind of critical takeaways, what would they be?
One is that this is a parent's role. Parents or people who are around kids have a role in making sure that those kids can participate in politics. And I'm not sure why we haven't thought that for a long time, but it is up to us to do that. And second is that these conversations cannot be off limits. I like to think about this as if we had some sort of like medical crisis. I don't know if you ever have, but I have. And if you've had some sort of medical crisis, I've never thought, you know what's going to make this better? I should learn nothing more and I should talk to no one about it. That's never the answer. You have to figure things out if you're going to get to a solution. And the way that I kind of think about where we are right now is sort of like a civics crisis, where we just don't know many things. And the idea that it's going to get better by not talking about it or not learning anymore is wrong. That's not how it is for medicine. It's not how it's going to be for civics. So the health of our democracy is something that we owe conversations about. We have to sort of be willing to do these discussions, even if they feel uncomfortable.
Those are great pieces of advice. And the takeaway that I have for all of you is go buy this book and read it. Dr. Cormack, thank you so much for joining me on The Politics Guys, and thanks for the opportunity to read your new book.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for these questions. They are really thoughtful, and they're unlike some of the other questions I've fielded, and part of this is because you know so much already, so this was really great for me. Thanks.
Well, and the listeners expect us to ask good questions. So again, thank you for writing this book. It's already spurred me to action, not only to read it, but to start to have these conversations with my kids. And so thanks again. Again, that was Stevens Institute of Technology political science professor and mom, Dr. Lindsay Cormack, on her new book, How to Raise a Citizen and Why It's Up to You to Do It. And it's available right now wherever you buy your books. That ends this interview episode of The Politics Guys. If you're not a supporter of The Politics Guys, if you want to have more interviews with amazing authors like Dr. Cormack, you should become a supporter. Supporting the show gives you access to all kinds of benefits, like access to these episodes without any of the advertisements or any of the interruptions. But there's so much more to being a supporter of The Politics Guys. It includes being part of our very active Discord group and all kinds of other benefits. So if you want to support great interviews like this one on how to raise a citizen, head over to patreon.com/thepoliticsguys right now. Take a look at the different levels of support and different options you'll have to support the show, support the mission, and support the guys behind the podcast. Again, go to patreon.com/politicsguys, because shows like this are only possible with your support. If you'd like to support us in other ways, we are also on Venmo at Politics Guys, and you can support us through PayPal. All of the support links are in the show notes, as well as at politicsguys.com/support. If you want to buy the book, How to Raise a Citizen, you'll also find a link to do so in those show notes. If you'd like to be any kind of member, but you just can't support us right now, we totally get that. We'd still love to have you share, subscribe, rate, and review this episode in whichever podcast app you use and on social media. If you've got a question, comment, correction, anything else you'd like to ask us about the book, about this interview with Dr. Cormack, or anything else we do at The Politics Guys, please drop us a line at mail@politicsguys.com. You can also reach us on Facebook and X, and you'll find all of those links, you guessed it, in the show notes. I'd like to give a huge thank you to the executive producers of The Politics Guys, Bruce Johnson, Wilma Marina, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, and Don Oglesby. And of course, a special thanks to all of you, our listeners. The other guys will be back with a full episode this weekend, and I hope you will join us then.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,